The Influence of Capitalism. The romanticism of numbers had still another aspect, important for the development of scientific habits of thought. This was the rise of capitalism and the change from a barter economy, facilitated by small supplies of variable local coinage, to a money economy with an international credit structure and a constant reference to the abstract symbols of wealth, gold, drafts, bills of exchange, eventually merely numbers. From the standpoint of technique, this structure had its origin in the towns of northern Italy, particularly Florence and Venice, in the 14th century. 200 years later, there was in existence in Antwerp an international bourse devoted to aiding speculation in shipments from foreign ports and in money itself. By the middle of the 16th century, bookkeeping by double entry, bills of exchange, letters of credit, and speculation in futures were all developed in essentially their modern form. Whereas the procedures of science were not refined and codified until after Galileo and Newton, finance had emerged in its present-day dress at the very beginning of the machine age. Jacob Fugger and J. Pierpont Morgan could understand each other's methods and point of view and temperament far better than Paracelsus and Einstein. The development of capitalism brought the new habits of abstraction and calculation into the lives of city people. Only the country folk, still existing on their more primitive local basis, were partly immune. Capitalism turned people from tangibles to intangibles. Its symbol, as Sombart observes, is the account book. Its life value lies in its profit and loss account. The economy of acquisition, which had hitherto been practiced by rare and fabulous creatures like Midas and Croesus, became once more the everyday mode. It tended to replace the direct economy of needs and to substitute money values for life values. The whole process of business took on more and more an abstract form. It was concerned with non-commodities, imaginary futures, hypothetical gains. Karl Marx well summed up this new process of transmutation. Since money does not disclose what has been transformed into it, everything, whether a commodity or not, is convertible into gold. Everything becomes saleable and purchasable. Circulation is the great social retort into which everything is thrown and out of which everything is recovered as crystallized money. Not even the bones of the saints are able to withstand this alchemy, and still less able to withstand it are more delicate things, sacrosanct things which are outside the commercial traffic of men. Just as all qualitative differences between commodities are effaced in money, so money, a radical leveler, effaces all distinctions. But money itself is a commodity, an external object capable of becoming the private property of an individual. Thus, social power becomes private power in the hands of a private person. This last fact was particularly important for life and thought, the quest of power by means of abstractions. One abstraction reinforced the other. Time was money, money was power. Power required the furtherance of trade and production. Production was diverted from the channels of direct use into those of remote trade, toward the acquisition of larger profits, with a larger margin, for new capital expenditures, for wars, foreign conquests, mines, productive enterprises. More money and more power. Of all forms of wealth, money alone is without assignable limits. The prince who might desire to build 5 palaces would hesitate to build 5,000. But what was to prevent him from seeking by conquest and taxes to multiply by thousands the riches in his treasury? Under a money economy, to speed up the process of production was to speed up the turnover. More money. And as the emphasis upon money grew in part out of the increasing mobility of late medieval society, with its international trade, so did the resulting money economy promote more trade. Landed wealth, humanized wealth, houses, paintings, sculptures, books, even gold itself were all relatively difficult to transport, whereas money could be transported after pronouncing the proper abracadabra by a simple algebraic operation on one side or another of the ledger. In time, men were more at home with abstractions than they were with the goods they represented. the typical operations of finance were the acquisition or the exchange of magnitudes. Even the daydreams of the pecuniary daydreamer, as Veblen observed, take shape as a calculus of profit and loss, computed in standard units of an impersonal magnitude. Men became powerful to the extent that they neglected the real world of wheat and wool, food and clothes, and centered their attention on the purely quantitative representation of it in tokens and symbols. To think in terms of mere weight and number, to make quantity not alone an indication of value, but the criterion of value, that was the contribution of capitalism to the mechanical world picture. So the abstractions of capitalism preceded the abstractions of modern science, and reinforced at every point its typical lessons and its typical methods of procedure. The clarification and the convenience, particularly for long-distance trading in space and time, were great, but the social price of these economies was a high one. Mark Kepler's words, published in 1595. As the ear is made to perceive sound, and the eye to perceive color, so the mind of man has been formed to understand, not all sorts of things, but quantities. It perceives any given thing more clearly in proportion as that thing is close to bare quantities as to its origins, but the further a thing recedes from quantities, the more darkness and error inheres in it. Was it an accident that the founders and patrons of the Royal Society of London, indeed some of the first experimenters in the physical sciences, were merchants from the city? King Charles II might laugh uncontrollably when he heard that these gentlemen had spent their time weighing air, but their instincts were justified. Their procedure was correct. The method itself belonged to their tradition, and there was money in it. The power that was science and the power that was money were, in final analysis, the same kind of power. The power of abstraction, measurement, quantification. But it was not merely in the promotion of abstract habits of thought and pragmatic interests and quantitative estimations that capitalism prepared the way for modern technics. From the beginning, machines and factory production, like big guns and armaments, made direct demands for capital far above the small advances necessary to provide the old-style handicraft worker with tools or keep him alive. The freedom to operate independent workshops and factories, to use machines and profit by them, went to those who had command of capital. While the feudal families, with their command over the land, often had a monopoly over such natural resources as were found in the earth, and often retained an interest in glassmaking, coal mining, and ironworks right down to modern times, the new mechanical inventions lent themselves to exploitation by the merchant classes. The incentive to mechanization lay in the greater profits that could be extracted through the multiplied power and efficiency of the machine. Thus, although capitalism and technics must be clearly distinguished at every stage, one conditioned the other and reacted upon it. The merchant accumulated capital by widening the scale of his operations, quickening his turnover, and discovering new territories for exploitation. The inventor carried on a parallel process by exploiting new methods of production and devising new things to be produced. Sometimes trade appeared as a rival to the machine by offering greater opportunities for profit. Sometimes it curbed further developments in order to increase the profit of a particular monopoly. Both motives are still operative in capitalist society. From the first, there were disparities and conflicts between these two forms of exploitation, but trade was the older partner and exercised a higher authority. It was trade that gathered up new materials from the Indies and from the Americas, new foods, new cereals, tobacco, furs. It was trade that found a new market for the trash that was turned out by 18th century mass production. It was trade, abetted by war, that developed the large-scale enterprises and the administrative capacity and method that made it possible to create the industrial system as a whole and weld together its various parts. Whether machines would have been invented so rapidly and pushed so zealously without the extra incentive of commercial profit is extremely doubtful. For all the more skilled handicraft occupations were deeply entrenched, and the introduction of printing, for example, was delayed as much as 20 years in Paris by the bitter opposition of the Guild of Scribes and Copyists. But while Technics undoubtedly owes an honest debt to capitalism, as it does likewise to war, it was nevertheless unfortunate that the machine was conditioned at the outset by these foreign institutions and took on characteristics that had nothing essentially to do with the technical processes or the forms of work. Capitalism utilized the machine not to further social welfare, but to increase private profit. Mechanical instruments were used for the aggrandizement of the ruling classes. It was because of capitalism that the handicraft industries in both Europe and other parts of the world were recklessly destroyed by machine products, even when the latter were inferior to the thing they replaced. For the prestige of improvement and success and power was with the machine, even when it improved nothing, even when, technically speaking, it was a failure. It was because of the possibilities of profit that the place of the machine was overemphasized and the degree of regimentation pushed beyond what was necessary to harmony or efficiency. It was because of certain traits in private capitalism that the machine, which was a neutral agent, had often seemed, and in fact has sometimes been, a malicious element in society, careless of human life, indifferent to human interests. The machine has suffered for the sins of capitalism. Contrariwise, capitalism has often taken credit for the virtues of the machine. By supporting the machine, capitalism quickened its pace and gave a special incentive to preoccupation with mechanical improvements. Though it often failed to reward the inventor, it succeeded by blandishments and promises in stimulating him to further effort. In many departments, the pace was over-accelerated and the stimulus was over-applied. Indeed, the necessity to promote continual changes and improvements, which has been characteristic of capitalism, introduced an element of instability into technics, and kept society from assimilating its mechanical improvements and integrating them in an appropriate social pattern. As capitalism itself has developed and expanded, these vices have in fact grown more enormous, and the dangers to society as a whole have likewise grown proportionately. Enough here to notice the close historical association of modern technics and modern capitalism, and to point out that, for all this historical development, there is no necessary connection between them. Capitalism had existed in other civilizations, which had a relatively low technical development, and technics made steady improvements from the 10th to the 15th century without the special incentive of capitalism. But the style of the machine has up to the present been powerfully influenced by capitalism. The emphasis upon bigness, for example, is a commercial trait. It appeared in guild halls and merchants' houses long before it was evident in technics, with its originally modest scale of operations.